Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you listening, my name is Steve Keller. I am the program developer and national speaker for Substance, formerly known as Drug Free Kids Canada. But as you know, today's workshop is focusing on commonly consumed substances. What we're here today to talk about are three of the most common substances that teens, and for that matter, young adults and adults in general, report trying and or using in Canada. That being alcohol, cannabis, as well as nicotine products. Now, I could have called this presentation Spotlight on Alcohol, Cannabis, and Vaping, but we do have to have a little bit of a conversation on tobacco, as it is not used the way it used to be, but it is still in the jargon, in the usage. But we are also going to talk about nicotine pouches as well, so that's why we talk about nicotine as sort of a general substance topic. Now, this workshop is going to cover a lot of ground today. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about each substance's background and effects on the body. We're going to clarify any myths or misconceptions that people may have about substance use. We're going to examine the possible harms or health risks associated with substance use. And finally, what we're going to do is discuss strategies to help lower risks of harm and help make safe and informed choices around substance use. Now, many of you who are listening today may be parents, guardians, social workers, educators, care providers, policymakers. Many of you, if not all of you, are involved in the lives of youth to some extent. What we hope you take from the presentation today is an understanding of topics, points of consideration, and knowledge that you can bring back to the youth that you work with. And if you'd like to learn more about any of our content, you can always visit our website anytime at talksubstance.org, or you can send me an email and I'll pop my email into the chat panel at the end of the presentation. Now, what is our vision at Substance? Well, our vision is to ensure that young people are able to live their lives free of problematic substance use and addiction. And I always like to stress the word problematic in our vision statement. It's a very important one. We understand that substance use is a choice. Previous awareness programs put a great deal of focus on abstinence-only approaches. The issue with an abstinence-only approach is it ignores the essence of choice that people have. And in fact, programs that promote an abstinence-only basis have been proven over and over to not really work. They don't impact the decision that someone has not to use. And in fact, some research has actually suggested that just say no programs actually increase the likelihood of people using drugs. They tend to create stigma. They create a great deal of judgment. They create this idea of normalization through abstinence. Now, the issue is this may make someone feel uncomfortable, increase their stress, increase their feelings of stigma, which may actually lead them to using more substances in order to cope with these feelings. The job is to understand that abstinence is a choice, just like substance use is a choice. We understand and acknowledge that choosing not to use drugs is a very healthy and safe solution. Now, that being said, there are those of you that are listening who may be using yourselves. There are those of you who are listening who work with people that are using. So what we like to do is give you the skills and strategies to reduce the risk of problematic use and the risk of harm associated with dependency or addiction. Now, before we get too far into the presentation, I do want to take a moment to introduce a new resource that our program has launched. We're thrilled to launch our Real Talks e-learning modules, which are a collection of 8 interactive, scenario-based online courses created especially for parents, guardians, and trusted adults. Now, each course explores real-life scenarios that involve youth and substance use, guiding parents through situations with practical tools, conversation strategies, and evidence-informed insight to help them talk with teens about alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, and more. Now, in the Real Talks modules, you can expect to find 8 engaging pieces rooted in real scenarios that parents face today. You're going to find short and digestible lessons built for ease and confidence, practical takeaways you can use in conversation or reflection, evidence-based guidance built on the latest research and best practices in youth substance prevention. And it's important to start these conversations. You see, when parents, and we say capital P parents, the idea of providers, youth support workers, child and youth workers, ECEs, educators, nurses, health practitioners, when you feel equipped and empowered, the young people that you support are able to thrive. When adults can have a conversation, a real, frank conversation about substance use with compassion and clarity and confidence, we strengthen our relationships and we support healthier choices. To learn more, you can visit the QR code that you see on the screen, or what you can also do is visit the website, which I'm going to post a link for in the chat. Take a look at your leisure. Okay. Wonderful. What's the matter? Let's talk about substances. As I mentioned, we are going to focus on three particular substances. We're going to focus on alcohol, we're going to focus on cannabis, and we're going to focus on nicotine. Now, before I start talking about what we know and what the research says about these substances, I would like to know what you know about these substances. So, in the chat panel, what I'd like you to do is put down what you know about alcohol. Know about it. What does it do? What do we use it for? What happens when people consume it? What do you know about alcohol? Now, I do presentations all across Canada. I present from British Columbia over to New Brunswick. I mean, last month alone, I saw over 6,000 kids. It was a very busy month. And I asked a great deal of teens what they know about alcohol. They gave me a lot of information. So I am curious to see what the audience is going to say here. It may help someone relax. It can smooth over feelings of anxiety. We know it's a depressant, also known as a sedative or a hypnotic or a tranquilizer. They have a whole pile of different names. What else do we know about alcohol? You know, it's funny. I asked teens, what do you know about alcohol? What happens when you drink? And the first thing they say is, you get drunk, you get turnt, you get tipsy. They talk about the intoxication. It impairs coordination, it impairs judgment and balance, slows reaction time. When you ask young people what alcohol does, the most common thing they tend to talk about are the parties. They talk about the excitement and the joy and the exuberance and the loudness they see when people drink. But as they think about it more, they also start to talk about some of the more risky or downsides or the negatives that they see about alcohol. They talk about perhaps people being miserable, people being angry, people being impulsive, people being violent. If we have a simple term about alcohol, it's not to say whether it's a good or bad thing. The term for alcohol, to be very simple, is a distilled or fermented drink. We have beer coming from hops and barley, wine from grapes, liquors from sugar cane and potatoes and various other vegetables and fruits, also known for its intoxicating effects. Now, what do you know about cannabis? Cannabis has a lot of names. You may have heard it called marijuana, weed, pot, grass, dope. When I was out east in New Brunswick, the kids told me they call it the devil's lettuce, and it made me chuckle. But what do you know about cannabis? What does cannabis do? It can cause psychosis. We're going to talk about that today. Absolutely. What else? What else do we know about cannabis? Well, it can make things funny for some people. We know it's a plant. Some people say it helps them function. We know it contains hundreds of chemicals, including cannabinoids, such as delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And if you don't feel like remembering that, just call it THC, as well as cannabidiol. Don't want to remember cannabidiol? Call it CBD. It may help people relax. It may take away pain. It may help someone sleep. Marijuana can be medicinal. We are going to talk about medical applications of cannabis. Now, what about nicotine? What do we know about nicotine? We know about nicotine. We know alcohol is a sedative. We know cannabis has sedating, stimulating, and hallucinogenic effects. We know nicotine is a stimulant. We also know it's highly addictive. Did you know that if 10 people tried nicotine today, statistically speaking, 9 of them would become addicted to it? That is how powerful of an addictive substance nicotine is. It actually has a higher rate of addiction than alcohol and cannabis and opioids. It is the, if not the most, it is one of the most addictive substances that we know of on the planet. And the way that it works, the way it creates addiction, we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now, every time I have a conversation about substance use, and every time you have a conversation about substance use, I recommend having a consideration around why people use. If you're ever working with a client and they mention to you that they use substances, it helps to know what it is they're trying to feel. Now, what are young people trying to feel when they use substances? What emotion, what outcome are they looking for when they use, when they drink, when they smoke, when they shoot, when they vape? What are they looking for in substance use? Happiness, fitting in. What else do we have? Peace, perhaps tranquility, relaxation. A lot of good answers here. We've got curiosity, we've got relaxation, we've got joy, we've got acceptance, we've got the idea of feeling better. See a lot of these emotions come up. Curiosity is actually the most common reason, according to the CCSA, that teens cite for cannabis use, especially their first time use. They may talk about using with friends. They talk about feeling relaxed. Here we talk about coping. We actually have other entire presentations that get into coping mechanisms if you want to learn more about those. People talk about using substances to try to feel relaxed, feel joy, feel pleasure. Before I worked in addiction, I used to work at a bar. And on Friday and Saturday nights, bars got real busy. They got real loud. They got real excited. People came to have fun with their friends. They came to get drunk. They came to enjoy themselves. We talk about acceptance. There are people that use because the people around them are using, or they feel like the people around them are using. And finally, there's the idea they may try to use to try to feel better. And whether or not the substance actually makes them feel better, we'll get into today. Now, if we understand why people use substances, it's equally as important to understand why they don't. Let's say you're having a conversation with a young person. Maybe you're talking about vaping. Maybe you're talking about smoking. You get 5, 10 minutes into the conversation, they go, "We don't need to talk about this. I don't use." Is it worth understanding why they don't? Well, absolutely. Understanding why they don't use can help reaffirm their values. It can help sort of point out and identify the reasons that they make the healthy choices that they do. So, why do you think a young person would choose not to use drugs, not to smoke, not to vape, not to drink, et cetera, et cetera? They want to be more present in their lives. Okay. They can be expensive. Oh, we're going to talk about money today. I love the money talk. Why else? They've seen the effects. They don't want to get in trouble. They've seen the health risks. They don't want to deal with the negative experiences. It's funny. I mentioned when I ask teens what happens when they drink, they always talk about getting drunk. They talk about the parties. They talk about Friday night. They talk about Saturday night. And so I'll ask them, why is it when people talk about alcohol, we never talk about Sunday morning? Why do we never talk about Saturday morning? What is it they don't want to talk about happening on a Sunday morning if they drank on a Saturday night? They don't want to talk about the hangover. They don't want to talk about the idea that, sure, they had a drink and for a few hours they went out with their friends, but they forgot what happened the night before and spent 8 hours throwing up in their bathroom or in their bedroom, wherever they wound up finishing. They've seen the negative experiences. Maybe they don't smoke because they know someone who has lung cancer. Maybe they don't vape because they've seen someone deal with panic and anxiety attacks that didn't get better when they vaped, even though they thought they did. Maybe they don't use cannabis because they've seen someone experience a psychotic break. Maybe they've seen someone experience a bad trip. Maybe they know someone who's experiencing bipolar or major depressive or social anxiety who found that cannabis offered them no reprieve, even though they thought that it would. They don't use in order to not be judged by their peers. They don't use due to their personal values. You may work with clients who come from a culture or a religion or a country that speaks out against substance use. So it may not be in their values to use. Like for some people, they just don't really want to use. They don't have an interest in using. It is important to understand both of these lists. We always focus on why people use substances, but if you work with a client who doesn't, it helps to ask why they don't. Get them to show you their values and get to know them and build rapport with them about something even different than substance use. Now, if they do use and they tell you why they started using, if their reasons for use have changed, it may be time for them to question what they're actually getting from substance use. Do teens start using drugs for the same reasons that they continue to use? What do you think? Do you think they start using for the same reasons they continue to use? In many cases, the answer is no. And I can give you two perfect examples here. Let's say you have a teen that uses to fit in. They use to socialize. Teens often talk about peer pressure when they talk about trying drugs. The Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Use Policy, the CSSDP, when they actually created their resource on cannabis back in the late 2010s, early 2020s, one of the things they made a point about was that peer pressure may be a determining factor in why people start to use drugs, but it's actually not a reason they continue to use. If you think about it, if I start using cannabis, I'm out with my friends on a Saturday night and they talk me into smoking bowls with them or trying edibles with them. They put some pressure on me, they lean on me. Come on, you'll have fun. Try it, try it, try it. I try it. That's peer pressure. That's why I tried to use. If 6 months later I am at home smoking bowls in my basement by myself. If 8 months later I am skipping class to get high by myself. If 10 months later I am showing up late for work because I got high and couldn't come in on time, am I still using because of peer pressure? Am I still using for a social aspect? I'm not. And if I'm not, why am I using? It's a question that youth often don't stop to ask themselves. If their reason for use has changed, they have to consider what they're actually getting out of use. Could be dependency, could be addiction. It could be something else entirely. The other example I always like to think of is vaping. Did you know the number one reason that teens cite for using vaping or for using vape products at about 20% is that they say they use them to manage stress and anxiety? This according to the Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey. Well, if I start vaping in grade 9, to manage my anxiety, to manage my stress because I'm overwhelmed and I'm having anxiety attacks, I'm irritable and I'm moody, I'm tired and I'm frustrated. If 2 years later I am still vaping and I'm still dealing with panic attacks, and I'm still dealing with anxiety attacks, and I'm still dealing with moodiness, and I'm still dealing with stress, why am I vaping? What am I getting from vaping if I still can't manage my stress and anxiety? When you have a youth reflect on this, it allows them question their own substance use. That's what makes this a worthwhile conversation. Let's talk about alcohol. Now, what is alcohol? Alcohol can be used medically to disinfect wounds as well as clean and disinfect surfaces. You see, we often forget, we talk about alcohol, and we often focus on like consuming alcohol, the recreational use of alcohol. Alcohol as an industrial product has significant uses. Its presence in the healthcare system can't actually be overstated. We use it to sanitize surgical suites. We use it to clean and sterilize. If you look at most cleaning products, what makes them so effective is the presence of alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol, which is also known as rubbing alcohol, we use as a sterilizer, and it should never be consumed. It can be very dangerous. And also we have methyl alcohol, also known as methanol or wood alcohol. We use it as a solvent, as antifreeze for fueling camping stoves. Now, recreational alcohol, commercial alcohol, can be processed into all sorts of different types of products. You've got beers, you've got wines, you've got spirits. And as of this year's Canadian Student Alcohol and Drug Survey, which looked at 2023-2024, was released earlier this year, we found that about 37% of teens in grade 7 to 12 report past year alcohol use. Now, this rate varies widely. By grade 7, the number is only around 6 to 7%. By grade 12, it is 67%. So we see a 10 times increase between grade 7 and grade 12. The average comes to around 40%. But the actual rate, when you look at the older grades, is significantly higher. The younger grades, it tends to be lower. This is the most commonly consumed psychoactive substance by teens, young adults, and adults in North America, unless you include caffeine, but it's a conversation for another day. What do we know about alcohol? Well, we know it's a depressant. It slows down functions of the central nervous system. For many people, a single drink can release tension. It reduces inhibition, makes them feel at ease, makes them feel outgoing. It affects how they behave, how they feel, and how they act. Now, some people may feel happy or excited when they drink, while others may become depressed or hostile. Sometimes kids will try to tell you that alcohol is a stimulant because they say they get more energy when they drink. Young adults say they get more energy when they drink. They go, well, doesn't that make it a stimulant? And I have to explain to them, it's not that it's stimulating you, it's that it's inhibiting your ability to make judgments and sound decisions. The example I used earlier this year was right after a storm. I was out east and we got talking about snow. I said, if I look out my window and I see a snowbank and we just had a big snowstorm, there's this freshly plowed snowbank near my house. And I decide I want to go jump in that snowbank. Sober me will judge that snowbank and think that looks cold. I don't know what's in it. I'm going to put on a coat. I'm going to put on a hat. I'm going to put on snow pants. I'm going to maybe kind of poke around in it a little bit. I'm going to jump in and have fun. If I'm intoxicated, my judgment is impaired. If I see that snowbank and I want to jump into it, I'm more likely to just jump into it. It is not because I have more energy. It is because my judgment is impaired. I will act more impulsively. Signs of impairment include flushed skin, like I said, impaired judgment, lower inhibition, dizziness, reduced muscle control and motor skills. So things that we need to that require coordination, things like working, operating machinery, driving a car, become very difficult when drinking. That is why it is illegal to drive after consuming alcohol. We also know it can reduce attention, slow reflexes, cause slurred speech, vision, and mood swings. Now, overconsumption, also known as alcohol poisoning, can cause nausea, severe dizziness, loss of memory because alcohol can actually temporarily shut down a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for coding and memory, which is why people, when they black out, can actually forget what they were doing. And significant alcohol poisoning can cause vomiting, fainting, coma, stupor, and in some cases, even death and fatality. Sure, the same thing. All just using the same word twice. Did you know in the United States that 20% of people who live with anxiety say that they drink to cope? When I lived abroad, I was braver to speak a new language when drinking. Why is this? Well, one thing about alcohol, again, if you have a bit of inhibition, if you have a bit of hesitation about something or a bit of doubt about something, when we're sober, we may make judgments that might actually prevent us from taking decisions that could be embarrassing or uncertain to us. If we're impaired, we may get a greater sense of a feeling of confidence, when in reality, it's just a greater sense of impulse. We want to do something, we won't question why we want to do it, we will try to do it. This is sort of like the idea of someone going to a karaoke club or a karaoke bar and not singing until they have a few drinks. When they're sober, they may question or feel uncomfortable with singing. What if people don't like my singing? What if I don't like how I sound? Well, after I have a few drinks, that curiosity, that inhibition that may prevent you isn't speaking to you anymore. It's been depressed. So the decision to sing becomes an easier one to make. 1 in 5 people in the US who live with anxiety say that they drink to manage stress and anxiety, which leads me to the next question. Do you believe that people who drink are more or less likely to develop anxiety or depressive disorders? What do we think? And you can put your response in the chat panel here. What do you think? We'll say more, more, more. The answer is here more. Now, as I mentioned before, alcohol releases tension and inhibition. The way that it works by doing this is it releases two transmitters through your brain at the same time. The first is dopamine, which creates these feelings of pleasure and motivation and improved mood. When we talk about dopamine, people often call it a pleasure seeking chemical in the brain. I often say it's the chemical that tells you, I like this, keep doing it. If I'm drinking a can of pop and I like it, my brain is going to release dopamine. If I'm doing a presentation and I know I'm coming to the home stretch and I'm almost done and I get to relax afterwards, my brain is going to release dopamine. If I'm hanging out with friends of mine and people that I care about, my brain naturally releases dopamine. I'm doing something I like. Substances like alcohol and nicotine and cannabis release dopamine synthetically. They force feed it into the brain at much higher levels than many other activities. This is what creates the feeling of pleasure and of joy. The second thing that alcohol does as a depressant, as many other depressants do this, is they release another chemical through the brain called gamma aminobutyric acid. And if you don't want to remember that, you call it GABA. GABA is a neuroinhibitor. Its job in the brain is to reset the central nervous system and disconnect neurotransmitters from the brain. So when we're dealing with anxiety, when we're dealing with stress, when we're dealing with frustration, rage, misery, depression, GABA flooding through the brain can reset our emotions and help us kind of take a breath. You ever seen someone when they're at like the height of frustration, at the height of fury, and there's that moment where they take this long exhale and you watch the shoulders sag and they start to come down a little bit? I always say that's the moment you can actually see GABA going through their brain. How does someone feel most commonly after they've had an anxiety attack? After they've had that feeling of panic? What's the most common physical feeling they get after it wears off? It's fatigue. It's tired because that is GABA calming down the nervous system. When a person drinks, alcohol synthetically forces GABA that's being stored up in your brain to release itself. That's why when people drink early on in the night, they tend to calm down. They're sitting at the bar, they're uptight, they're sitting at a party, they're nervous, they have a drink or two, they relax. They slump down, the shoulders slump down. That's GABA coming out of the brain. Now, the problem is what alcohol also does is it's neurotoxic to the parts of the brain that create GABA. So later on in the night, if they have anything that causes an emotional reaction or an emotional outburst, there isn't GABA running through the brain to try to calm them down. which can make them more emotionally unstable or a little bit more impulsive. They don't have that feeling to calm them down. And furthermore, because alcohol damages the brain's ability to create GABA, drinking over time makes it harder for them to manage their stress and anxiety, especially when they're sober. Now, drinking before bed can also make a person feel less rested and more overtired, as alcohol prevents the brain from falling into a deeper sleep. This is why people that drink before they go to bed are more likely to fall asleep, but they're also more likely to wake up not feeling rested because they didn't get as deep of a sleep. Furthermore, many symptoms of hangovers actually include anxiety, particularly for people who struggle with disordered anxiety. We also know that alcohol is associated with both violent and impulsive behavior. In Canada, did you know that nearly 2 out of every 5 violent crimes reported to police state that the offender was intoxicated by alcohol when the offense took place? Now, it's not only violent behavior that's associated with heavy drinking. Sexual violence and sexual assaults are more commonly reported by alcohol than any other drug, including gamma hydroxybutyrate, Rohypnol, and other drugs implicated in date rapes. In fact, in 2015, 40% of women and 25% of men who were sexually assaulted said that the incident was related to the perpetrator's alcohol or drug use. Last year, McGill University reported that 90% of all sexual assaults on university campuses across Canada are facilitated by alcohol. And in Canada as a nation, about 54% of sexual assault incidents in the general population were believed to be related to alcohol or drug use, with alcohol being cited as the most common substance reported. Now, alcohol's role in sexual assaults is twofold. Either the perpetrator or the victim or both may be intoxicated. The perpetrator, being drunk, may take a more aggressive or impulsive decision or make a move without consent, while the victim may be too inebriated to resist or stop them. And furthermore, if a person is charged with a sexual assault, claiming that they were impaired by alcohol is not an admissible legal defense. Now, when we look at depression, we also know, according to CMHA, that Canadians with moderate to severe depression are 3 times more likely to have a problem with alcohol. And Stats Canada reports that a quarter of all deaths by suicide in the last decade in Canada involve alcohol use. That is a higher rate than any other substance. Every time I do a presentation about substance use, especially because I talk about a lot of different substances, one of the most common things I get asked, regardless of the group, is what happens if I mix blank with blank? What if I drink and smoke? What if I snort and drink? What if I use opioids and smoke weed? What if I use cannabis and smoke tobacco or a vape? So my next question for you is, how many high school age youth report mixing alcohol with other drugs? Is it 1 in 10, 1 in 8, 1 in 6, or 1 in 4? 6, 1 in 4. The answer here is 1 in 6. This is actually higher than it was in 2020, 2021, when the rate was only about 1 in 8. We've actually seen an increase in what's known as polysubstance use among teens in Canada. Now, what happens if you mix these substances together? And we're going to start with cannabis and alcohol. The first thing that we see is an increased risk of impairment. We also would call this greening out if someone experiences what we know as cannabis poisoning. People that mix cannabis and alcohol together, a process some people call crossfading, can actually make each other's effects stronger. Alcohol is a diuretic, it pushes fluid out of the body. So when a person smokes cannabis and THC is going through their system, their body will actually pull more THC out of the blood than it normally would, which can get them more impaired by cannabis if they drank first. Furthermore, if they smoke weed before drinking, research suggests that THC can actually prevent the brain from recognizing when it's being impaired by another substance. Meaning that if they smoke weed and then drink, they won't recognize that they're becoming drunk as quickly as they would, which will lead them to drinking more, which can increase the risk of alcohol poisoning. I mentioned a moment ago that alcohol causes dehydration. In fact, if you look at most of the symptoms of hangover, most of them are caused by dehydration. The person's got dry mouth, they've got a migraine, they're stiff, they're achy, they're weak, they're dizzy. Most of it's caused by severe dehydration, which is why it's important if someone is drinking multiple alcoholic beverages, it's recommended they take a break to drink water, to have food, to keep themselves hydrated. And if they find that their rate of, say, going to the bathroom is increasing or the rate of sweating is increasing, it's a good time for them to stop drinking. Finally, we have risks of hospitalization. Mad Canada reports that using cannabis and alcohol together before driving increases the risk of fatality by up to 40 times. And mixing cannabis with alcohol can actually increase the risk and severity of alcohol poisoning. And I'll explain why when we get to the cannabis section. Now, what happens if I mix cannabis with other drugs? Well, the first thing to understand is that cannabis causes changes in blood pressure. It causes peaks and valleys. CBD and THC both do this. This is why cannabis has recently been associated with an increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and heart disease, is they both change heart rate, blood pressure, and blood flow to the heart. Now, mixing cannabis with other substances that do the same, including prescription medications, stimulants, and sedatives, can increase the risk of dangerous spikes and drops in blood pressure. Now, mixing cannabis with stimulants or hallucinogens can increase the risk of psychotic episodes. So, mixing cannabis with coke and meth, LSD, MDMA, ketamine may cause more profound or severe delusions and hallucinations, resulting in breaks from reality, which may make a person react aggressively, unpredictably, or even dangerously to themselves or to someone else. And finally, mixing cannabis with opioids together increases the risk of coma and death, as both of these substances can cause dizziness, sleepiness, and confusion. And some research even suggests that the use of cannabis may slow the removal of fentanyl from the body, which can make an overdose last longer than it normally would. Finally, we have alcohol and stimulants. Mixing alcohol with stimulants can have offsetting effects, making someone believe that they're less impaired. If they take a stimulant and alcohol and they drink, they may not feel as dizzy from the alcohol as they would. They may not feel as anxious or energetic from the stimulant as they normally would. This may make them think that they're not becoming impaired. However, just because they feel sober, it does not mean that they are. The substances are still affecting the body and can still increase risk of harm. Mixing alcohol with sedatives, such as sleeping medication, Gravol, or other sedatives or opioids, can make breathing dangerously weak, can also reduce heart rate and reduce blood pressure to life threatening levels. And finally, mixing alcohol with opioids, such as fentanyl and heroin, increase the risk of overdose and death. Drinking while using fentanyl can limit the effectiveness of Narcan. Furthermore, if a person has lost consciousness due to an overdose and you Narcan them and they start breathing, they may vomit as they start to breathe from alcohol poisoning, which can get caught in their throat and they would aspirate the alcohol and vomit and choke on it. And finally, we also know that mixing sedatives like alcohol with opioids can lower the time that Narcan is effective, increasing the risk that a person will fall back into overdose. Last question about alcohol. Alcohol use increases the risk of developing over how many short and long term 85, 140, or 240? What do we think? 140. Survey says 140, 140, 140. Health Canada actually reports it's over 200. In fact, did you know that alcohol is one of the only substances that damages every single part of the human body? It's one of the only ones we consume. Furthermore, it is one of the only substances whose withdrawal after years of systemic abuse can actually kill a person. Some of the health risks associated with alcohol include damages to the brain. So we see issues with learning and memory, aneurysms, Alzheimer's disease. We see high blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, stroke, pneumonia, tuberculosis, pancreatitis, diabetes, cirrhosis, liver failure, UTIs, dehydration, ulcers, bleeding, kidney failure, early aging, eczema, dry skin, fractures, impaired bone growth, thinning of the bones, vision degeneration, blindness, vitamin deficiency, malnutrition, gum disease, various cancers, obesity, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, sexual impotence, as well as seizures and strokes caused by withdrawal, just to name a few. You see, often when we do presentations and have conversations about substance use, we spend a great deal of time nowadays talking about opioids and cannabis and vaping. They are important topics. However, what gets missed in many of these conversations is the need to talk about alcohol. Alcohol is the most commonly used psychoactive substance in the country, by far, none are even close. 6 million Canadians ages 12 and above report heavy drinking at least once a month. That is not 6 million who report drinking once a month. That is heavy drinking once a month. We also know that alcohol, not fentanyl, not tobacco, not cannabis, not cocaine, alcohol is the leading risk factor for death and disability for Canadians between the ages of 15 to 49. We also know that alcohol related harms totaled nearly $20 billion for Canadians in 2020, according to the CCSA. That is a higher rate than tobacco and fentanyl combined. And finally, alcohol is a factor in a quarter of all traffic fatalities. I always like to start with alcohol, and I find it's important to include alcohol in this conversation because we spend so much time talking about other substances that the most commonly used and the most harmful in terms of quantity is often overlooked. Let's talk about the green stuff, shall we? What do we know about Canada? Well, do you know what percentage of high school age youth in Canada report using cannabis in the last 12 months, according to the Canadian Student Alcohol and Drug Survey? Is it 10, 18, 53, or 81%? 53, 53, 53. One vote for 18. Hannah, you're actually correct. The answer is indeed 18%. The majority of teens don't actually use cannabis. In fact, there is not a single survey in the last 15 years that has ever shown the majority of teens smoke weed. Furthermore, the rate of cannabis use since legalization is no different than it was before legalization. I mean, we saw an increase of about 1%, but it was not nearly the increase that people expected. There was a fear at legalization that making cannabis legal was going to lead to kids smoking weed like never before. That didn't happen. Where we did see an increase in cannabis consumption was college and university age youth and seniors. Fun fact, seniors was the second fastest growing demographic. So, using cannabis because a teen thinks that everyone is doing it may expose them to health problems that their peers may not experience. For example, youth with a history of anxiety disorders, a family history of substance use disorders, psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar may be at a greater risk of developing these conditions if they use cannabis. And it's important to point out to youth that the majority of teens don't actually use, because if they're basing their decision on who's using, to remind them that most people don't use is actually a great way to show them that their decision needs to be based on themselves. We know cannabis is a plant, talked about it before. Its use is actually traced back as far as 5000 BC. We've seen it used by humans for over 7,000 years that we know of. We know it's the second most commonly consumed substance by youth in Canada after alcohol. And we also know that the use of THC can cause a different feeling for a person based on various factors. When we talk about nicotine in a bit, when we talked about alcohol, there's a common pattern of effect of what these substances do because of their stimulating and sedating effects. One of the hardest things to explain about cannabis is that it lacks a pattern of effect with people. Two different people can consume the exact same product and have completely different nights because THC's impact on the body can differ based on your age, your experience with cannabis, the type of product you used, your medical history, your mood, your state of mind, your mental health, your physical health, why you're in a good mood, why you're in a bad mood, how many things are stressing you out, what is stressing you out, what is not stressing you out, what else you've consumed, if you drank, if you snorted, if you smoked, all of these factors and so many more can change how cannabis affects the body. It lacks a pattern of effect. When we talk about cannabis, I'm going to give you 3 examples. Earlier, people mentioned that people smoke weed to calm themselves down. Did you know that cannabis causes panic attacks? And that both of those statements are true? Earlier, people mentioned people smoke weed to help themselves sleep at night. Did you know cannabis causes insomnia? And both of those statements are true? One of the medical uses of cannabis we're going to talk about in a bit. Fun fact, the medical use I'm going to tell you actually can be offset by using too much cannabis, that it can both cause and prevent one of the things that it can be medically used for. I'll show you that in a moment. I keep mentioning cannabinoids, and I talked about THC and CBD twice. Now, if we were to define THC, THC changes how we think and act and see the world. When people are talking about getting high, they're talking about using THC. And the more THC that a person uses, the stronger the effect of the product will be. It's also important to note that THC levels in cannabis have been increasing rapidly since the 1980s. Sometimes I do presentations for parents or grandparents or guardians, and a common response I'll get from them is they go, well, what's the big deal? I smoked weed when I was a kid, or I tried weed when I was a kid. What's the big deal if my teen tries it? It's because the product that they consumed 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago is very different than the product we see today. In the 1980s, the average THC level of plants was about 1 to 3% THC. In 2018, when cannabis was made legal for recreational use, the average THC percentage in the plant was 15 to 30%. In the 1980s, we did not have cannabis vapes or cannabis extracts. We do today, and their THC potency can be up to 90 or even 97 or 98% THC. And the higher the level of THC, the greater the level of effects, both beneficial and harmful. We're on that in a bit. CBD in cannabis is researched more for its potential medical applications. And in Canada, CBD can be prescribed to treat several different things, including chronic pain management, treating nausea or vomiting, as well as increasing appetite. So if someone's living with arthritis, HIV, cancer, if they're living with multiple sclerosis, if they're living with ALS, if they're living with severe trauma from a physical accident, they may actually be prescribed CBD, low dose THC, because research has suggested that CBD may reduce inflammation, which could be medically beneficial. Now, research in 2023 has actually started to sort of question whether or not cannabis actually helps with pain management, because a study, I believe it was from the University of Ottawa, 40 different longitudinal studies of cannabis and pain. In 36 of those studies actually found that CBD had no effect on pain and that it was more of a placebo effect. So its degree of pain management is reviewable. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's reviewable. People may be prescribed CBD to treat nausea or vomiting if they're going through chemotherapy. Similar if they have a significant eating disorder as a way of increasing appetite. If you've ever seen someone smoke weed, get the munchies, you understand what I mean. Cannabis, CBD, small amounts of THC can actually calm down the stomach if they're feeling nauseous. So if someone's going through chemotherapy, one of the harms of chemotherapy for all of the help it can do medically for someone living with cancer is that it causes a great deal of nausea, of vomiting, and it robs a person of their appetite. So when they don't eat and they can't hold down food, they start shedding weight significantly, which makes them weaker, which makes it harder for them to fight off the infection and harder to survive the chemo. Cannabis can actually help them hold down food and be hungry to help keep the weight on. Medically, that could be very helpful. Now, I used to do public speaking specifically on cannabis through the YMCA, through a program we had funded through Health Canada. And when I spoke about cannabis, one of the most common things I heard from youth and adults alike was that cannabis needs to be treated more seriously medically. And I agree. I believe cannabis should be treated very seriously medically. Did you know that 1 in 7 teens who smoke weed, according to the Canadian Cannabis Survey, uses it for a medical purpose? And did you know that over 80% of them have never talked to a healthcare provider about what that medical purpose is? The comparison I often make is driving my car on the highway and my car starts making a funny noise. If I just turn up the radio, I can make the noise go away. But if I don't take it to a mechanic, I don't actually know if it's going to go away on its own. If you are going to take cannabis seriously medically, that means you have to speak with a healthcare provider about it. You have to treat it the way you would treat any other medical product. Cannabis does not interact well with many other medications. It can cause peaks and valleys in blood pressure. It is not recommended for people who are pregnant. It is not recommended for people with heart conditions. It is not recommended for people using thyroid medication, diabetes medication, seizure medication. And it is important to speak with your doctor about cannabis. True or false? If someone smokes weed with THC, they can get high in less than 2 minutes. What do you think? Kids talk to me about this all the time. They go to a party with their buddies. Buddy of theirs smokes weed. They say, "Oh, I'm feeling it already." And your friends go, "No, you're not. You can't feel it that fast." What do you think? Can someone get high in 2 minutes or less if they smoke weed? Well, yes, they can, because your lungs are very good at what they do. Dried leaf product, which is the most common way people consume cannabis, by the way. Those are your pipes, your joints, your bongs, etc. Your THC potency is about 15 to 30%. You can actually feel the effects of cannabis in less than 30 seconds, because what happens is when you smoke it, THC goes into your lungs, your bloodstream quickly picks up THC as it would pick up oxygen, carries it to your heart, and your heart pumps that THC directly up to the brain. It is a very quick process. So they get high within seconds, maybe minutes. The peak will come around 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then it will wear off after the next 6 to 12 hours with some residual effects. Now, smoking cannabis is considered the most physically risky way to use, as the regular buildup of dried leaf product can cause a buildup of tar in the lungs. It is also worth noting that the plant matter in cannabis contains many of the same carcinogens that is found in tobacco, and that the use of these substances is associated with lung infections, bronchitis, COPD, and asthma. Now, people who vape also find the effects are very, very quick. The potency of THC vapes can be significantly higher, can be up to or over 90%. We know the effects are very quick because, again, as we're inhaling, they go from the lungs to the heart to the brain. However, unlike dried leaf product, which is seen as more physically risky because of the plant matter and the chemicals and carcinogens that exist in the plants, vape products are seen as a more psychologically or a mentally risky way to use. The reason being that high elevated levels of THC, heavy use of cannabis, overuse of cannabis can cause cannabis poisoning, characterized by anxiety and panic attacks, heart palpitations, fever, nausea, vomiting, delusions, and even psychotic episodes in vulnerable people. Now, a cannabis induced psychotic episode is not a bad trip where someone got high and saw something that scared them for a few hours. A cannabis induced psychotic episode is a medical condition whereby a person experiences the symptoms of a psychotic episode that can last for a period of 14 to 35 consecutive days. If someone is using cannabis and they begin to experience overwhelming thoughts or feelings or emotions or begin to act dangerously and erratically, it is important they seek medical attention. Finally, we have edibles. Third most common way that youth use, second most common way that adults over 19 use. Now, the potency of an edible, it varies based on how much is added. For those of you listening, does anyone know how long it takes for an edible to affect the body? If I smoke weed, I can feel it in a couple minutes. Now, what if I eat it? How long is it going to take? A couple minutes, 20 minutes, a couple seconds, a couple hours? What do you think? Approximately 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, 30 minutes, 2 hours, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour. The average effects we see are around, Nicholas, you got it. It's about 30 minutes to 2 hours. Now, for some people with a lower metabolism, it could be 3 or 4 hours. If someone's had a lot to eat, if someone's got a full stomach, it could even be longer as well. The effects peak between 2 to 12 hours, and they can take up to 24 hours to wear off. For some people, the residual effects of cannabis edibles can actually last up to 36 hours. Now, edible cannabis is actually the most common cause of cannabis hospitalizations among youth in Canada, according to Sick Kids. And part of the reason is there's two reasons. For young kids, it's that they accidentally ingest cannabis edibles. So if you're someone who uses, or if you're working with someone who uses, if they have a younger sibling, they need to keep them stored out of reach of small children. And also dogs. Because if your dog eats your cannabis, it can be very dangerous. They may act erratically, they may get scared, they may get aggressive, they may run away. And as I often like to say, if your dog walks into the room, if you're someone that uses edibles and your dog tells you, I ate your edibles, something's going on, I strongly recommend you also take a break from substance use because your dog can't talk. Good. Saying that as your buddy. The other reason that edibles can put younger people and new users in the hospital is that their effects take longer. And because users don't feel anything for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, they're more inclined to have more. And they consume more and they consume more. And because the effects come on slowly, and the reason they come on slowly, so you know, is that when you eat THC, it has to travel through your GI tract and land in your liver, and then your liver slowly massages it out to the body, similar to how medications work. But because they take a while, people will consume more thinking that they're not working. So if you know someone who's using edibles, it is important that they start with a small amount and wait to see how they feel. Or as Health Canada likes to say, start low, go slow. Use among teens can increase or decrease the risks of developing, existing, or worsening problems with anxiety and panic attacks. What do we think? Did you know the most common reason that teens and young adults cite for using cannabis medically is to treat anxiety and depression? But yet, despite that, you all vote that cannabis use increases the risks. You'd, you'd be correct. Some people say they feel less anxious when they get high, but others actually experience effects that worsen anxiety. As THC floods its way through the brain, it can create a lot of dopamine and pump it through the nucleus accumbens, which creates feelings of motivation and pleasure and these upbeat feelings. However, THC will also cause dopamine to form and develop and push through what's called the amygdala in the brain, which creates that fear response, that anxiety response, that fight or flight principle. This is why people, when they smoke weed, may experience euphoria, but also paranoia. They may experience excitement, but also fear. They may experience joy, but also anxiety, because THC is affecting your reward center of the brain and your fear center of the brain at the same time. The current research into cannabis use does not actually support using cannabis to treat anxiety and stress. And in fact, research from the University of Ottawa actually showed from 2008 2019 that Canadians who experienced cannabis related harms were 4 times more likely to develop new anxiety disorders. And the risk was higher if they used before the age of 25. Which of the following skills can be affected by THC from cannabis? Is it judgment, memory, managing emotions, or all of the above? What do we think? Quick answer here. All of the above, all the above. Oh, you guys are right on the ball today. I like this audience. You would be correct. It's all of the above. There are people that are going to smoke weed that are going to have a lot of fun. They're going to smoke weed. They're going to relax. They're going to play video games. They're going to watch Scooby Doo. They're going to eat some cookies. They're going to go to bed. They're going to sleep like a rock. There are other people that are going to use cannabis. They're going to be up all night. They're going to hear voices. They're going to be terrified. They're going to be dizzy. They're going to be nauseous. Sometimes it's the same person from one day to the next. The short term risks of cannabis can include dizziness, confusion, anxiety, difficulty with concentration, as well as lower reaction time and concentration. The long term risks, as cannabis is neurotoxic to the hippocampus, may actually show that the use of cannabis, particularly during teenage years, can cause issues with memory, learning, affects the decision making and problem solving. We also know youth that consume cannabis are more likely to become dependent or addicted to use. We also see increased risks and associations with anxiety and self harm. We do see a correlation between cannabis and depression, however, not necessarily a causation. What we more so see is if people are living with depression and using cannabis and not getting their depression treated through medical support, through speaking with a healthcare advisor, through speaking with a counselor, through connecting with someone that they trust, if they're not alleviating their depression, as their depression worsens, they may turn to using more cannabis to manage the feelings. It doesn't make them go away. And finally, we know these risks are elevated for people that use under the age of 25. A lot to cover. Youth under 25 who begin using cannabis are twice as likely to develop a cannabis use disorder as those who start after the age of 25. This is because the brain is still developing, and that presence of dopamine and those feelings of myelination, of connecting to things that we find interesting that happen during our adolescence, if we choose to use substances during our teenage years, we are actually more likely to interpret them in our brain as more important than they actually are, which increases the risk that we may become dependent on using them to feel joy or feel balance. Second, CAMH last year reported that teens who use cannabis are at an 11 times higher risk of developing a psychotic disorder compared to teens who do not use cannabis. Third, THC use is associated with an increased risk of heart attack and heart disease in young adults and adults. And finally, cannabis, not alcohol, cannabis is the most common substance found in dead and injured drivers in Canada. Well, lots to go. Very last section that we have for today is we are going to talk about nicotine, vaping, smoking, etc. Now, when we talk about nicotine, last year, do you know how many Canadians in grades 7 through 12 reported the past 30-day use of vape products? Was it 7, 12, 16, or 33? What do we think? 33, 16, 16. So it says The answer is actually 16%. Now, what is nicotine? We find nicotine in tobacco plants. In fact, you can actually find nicotine in any nightshade plant. Now, before you think this means you should go home and smoke your tomatoes, I strongly advise against that. Many nightshades also contain dangerous chemicals to the body, including arsenic and cyanide. What else do we know about nicotine? We know it is known for being extremely addictive. It is more likely to result in addiction among teens and young adults. We also know it can be consumed in cigarettes, through vaping, in patches placed on the skin, as well as pouches placed behind the lower lip. Xanax, Xanax, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Huh. Sometimes we have conversations about substance use and we think we're going to talk about mental health or physical health. One of the conversations that I find actually resonates with youth the most is to get them thinking about money. Do you know how much the average teen who vapes spends on vape products in Canada per week? Is it 15, 25, or $40? So you vote for 25. I think this being according to the Heart and Stroke Foundation. 40. It's actually a little lower than some people may think. The answer is actually $15 a week. Now, $15 a week doesn't sound like much. There is a wide variance here. You will have some people that vape daily. You will have some people that vape most days. You will also have some people that only vape with their friends. They only vape on occasion. They limit their vaping. So your average is 15 with a wide variance. So often when I do this presentation, I like to ask if I'm presenting to teens, what would you do with $15 in your pocket? What do you think most of them are going to say? If I ask teens, what would you do if you had $15 in your pocket right now? What do you think they're going to tell me? There's a real common thing they say they do if they have $15. What is it? They get food. Yes, they want food. You ever talk about Subway, Tim Hortons, things like that? $15 will get them food. The beauty about money and the beauty about financial literacy, which, by the way, really need to work on our financial literacy talks with kids. But the beauty about financial literacy and money is understanding that money adds up. Canadians spend $15 a week on vape products between the ages of 15 and 19, according to the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Cannabis, the average Canadian 16 and above who uses cannabis spends about $65 a month on cannabis. They spend about $67 a month on alcohol, according to Stats Canada, being those above the legal age. And yes, every time I say $67, someone in the crowd who's a kid does this and says 6, 7, and they laugh, and we carry it. But when we show these numbers, $15 a week on vaping is $65 a month. $65 on cannabis, $67 on alcohol. This would put your monthly total at $197 for substance use if you did all three. So the next thing you can ask a teen is, what would you do with $197? Now they'll talk about new stuff for their console, new equipment for their four-wheeler, new equipment for their hockey gear or their whatever sport they're playing. Larger food purchases, going out. If they own a car, it could be getting gas. Annual totals would be $780 vaping, $780 cannabis, $813 alcohol, for a nice round total of $2,373 per year. You could ask, what could you do with $2,373? But the really fun question to ask is this. Did you know that the average teen that uses substances begins using at around age 13 to 14? This would put them at around grade 8, grade 9, right? Grade 8, grade 9. Say it's the summer leading to grade 9. If the average teen spends the average amount, and if, say, they use all three of these substances, we'll start worst case scenario, all three of these substances. I say worst case financial. All three of these substances start at grade 9 to the end of grade 12. You can ask, what would you do with an extra $10,000 by the end of high school? Because $2,300, we'll say $2,400 if we round up, is $9,600 for 4 years. And if they used over the summer, if they used in grade 8 a little bit, that puts their number to 10 grand. I was like presenting to grade 12s and showing them this. I was presenting at a school earlier this year, and I pulled this number up, and I laughed. I've told this story many times. I saw this kid, he looks up at the board and he looks at the number and he shakes his head. He says, that's not right. He pulls his phone out of his pocket and he starts typing on his phone. He's looking up at the board. Types on his phone again. He looks back up at the board. He types again. And then his phone just lands on his desk and he goes, he had his banking app open. And what he was doing was he was totaling up all of the cash withdrawals he made on his banking app. Because every time he pulled cash, he was buying substances with it. So he comes up to me after class and he says, I spent $2,800 on drugs last year. I said, well, when did you figure that out? He goes, just now. He said, I've never once looked at it. He says, I don't even open my banking app. Kids need to understand the cost, not just the physical and mental risks. When we talk about the reasons people use drugs and what they get out of using drugs, whatever they get out of them, they're always putting something in them. Using nicotine can make stress and anxiety increase or decrease. What do you think? Increase? Increase? The answer is increase and decrease. Because what nicotine does is it force feeds the brain dopamine. It increases energy, it increases motivation, and it causes feelings of relaxation. In fact, Yale Medicine last year reported that use of substances like nicotine and opioids can actually release dopamine through the body at levels 10 times higher than anything else you would do naturally. This can create an overwhelming feeling of pleasure. So if someone is feeling anxious, if someone is feeling stressed, if someone has a headache, if someone is moody, if someone has tightness of the chest, if they've got tunnel vision, if they're dizzy, if they're confused, if they're concerned, if they're feeling overwhelmed, the use of nicotine can make all of that go away for about 30 to 60 minutes. And when the effects wear off, there will be a recording available, by the way. Thank you. People may start to feel restless. They may feel irritable. They may be anxious. They may be overtired because nicotine withdrawal mimics the symptoms of an anxiety attack. So when someone is anxious, when they're using to manage their anxiety, nicotine can kick it down the road. But when it comes back, whatever was stressing them out comes back. Not only do those feelings come back, but they are exacerbated by the presence or the removal, rather, of nicotine, because nicotine withdrawal mimics anxiety. Problem is, the brain quickly learned that using nicotine made those feelings go away. So the next time they get stressed, they vape again. This creates that cycle of reward-based addiction to nicotine. Unlike smoking, vaping is a risk-free way of using. We accept this, or we do challenges. What do we think? People often say to me, well, vaping's harm reduction. And I agree with that. It's not harm removal. You want to challenge this. You'll notice I didn't call it true or false. I want to challenge this. There are still risks of vaping. Now, if we compare it to tobacco, tobaccos we know are significant. In fact, did you know that tobacco products have been used commercially since the 1600s? But the first public link to smoking and cancer wasn't announced in Canada till 1964. In the 1950s, we all of a sudden had this notice that it was strange. You know, people that smoked tobacco were dying like 10 to 20 years earlier than people who didn't. We didn't really know why that was, so we started looking into what do we know is in tobacco. We found that the tobacco plant, the additives, not the chemicals, not the processing, the plant contains over 70 chemicals that cause cancer, including tar, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, cyanide, quinoline, benzene, cadmium, aluminum, arsenic, etc., etc., etc. Tobacco use reduces life expectancy, according to the Canadian Cancer Society, by an average of 10 years or more, usually around 12. And half of people who smoke cigarettes statistically will die from the cancers that we know they cause. Knowing this, we understood there was a significant risk of smoking tobacco. This is why we railed against it so hard, and for good reason. There is a significant risk here. So in 2004, we introduced vaping products. We've had 21 years to research vaping. We do not have 50 years of research. We do not have 70 years of research. We do not have 40 years of research. We do know that vape products do not contain many of the carcinogens found in tobacco. However, they do contain glycerol, propylene glycol, formaldehyde, metal pieces, acetaldehyde, cadmium, and benzene. Now, formaldehyde is an embalming fluid we know causes throat cancer. Metal pieces, this would be from someone using like a low-grade vape pen. If the metal coil actually breaks down, they can actually inhale it, which causes lacerations in the throat and lung infections. You have acetaldehyde and cadmium, which are both associated with lung illnesses. Benzene you may find in the vape pen itself if someone buys a low-grade vape pen. Many of your illicit or unregulated pens may be lined with plastic, and benzene is one of the active chemicals that we use to create plastic. So when you melt it, benzene actually enters the lungs, and benzene is associated with leukemia. Finally, we know that unregulated vape products can contain many dangerous or unknown chemicals, and cannabis vape products can be up to 3 times stronger than dried leaf cannabis products, as we mentioned earlier. Finally, we have nicotine pouches, Xanax, Sonics. We see commercials for these, right? Products to help people quit smoking. That is what they are intended to be, to help people quit. They were first sold in Canada 2 years ago. However, similar to vape products, there is no long-term research into the health risks of using these products. Now, what we do know is that nicotine can be poisonous if swallowed or absorbed through the skin, and that nicotine poisoning can cause nausea, rapid breathing, dizziness, abnormal heartbeat, paralysis, and lung failure. And we know that nicotine pouches can contain many of the same carcinogens as tobacco, including ammonia, heavy metals, and formaldehyde. In fact, in 2022, the American Medical Association actually did a study of 44 different products that were nicotine pouches, and they found 26 of them contained many of the same carcinogens that tobacco does. These are recommended for people trying to quit using, but not recommended for anyone else. Did you know that 125 people die every single day due to smoking related illnesses in Canada? That is 6 times the amount of people who currently die from fentanyl. And that 1/8 of tobacco related deaths are caused by secondhand smoking. We know that vaping during teenage years can impair memory, learning, and concentration. It is also known to worsen or cause symptoms of anxiety and depression. 20% of youth who vape say they do so because they're trying to manage their stress and anxiety. But an additional 20% say they do because they're addicted to it. Teens who vape are 2.5 times more likely to report poor or fair mental health than they are to report good or excellent mental health. And finally, nicotine use during pregnancy can impair brain development and can cause premature birth and low birth weight, increasing risk of illness, infection, and infant mortality. This is why it is not recommended to smoke or vape near someone who's pregnant, and it is recommended not to consume nicotine or tobacco products while pregnant or while breastfeeding. 5 minutes left. Very last section of the presentation. When can substance use become a problem? I am not here to say that substances are morally bad. Yes, I have to point out harm. That's my job. We have to talk about risk. We have to talk about harm. But it is worth noting that not all substance use is problematic. And substance use itself exists on a spectrum. Many people don't use. And the avoidance of substances, to be fair, is one of the greatest ways to reduce risk of harm. However, there are beneficial uses to substances. Like I mentioned earlier, cannabis has medical applications for things for people living with chemotherapy, for people living with chronic pain. Alcohol as an industrial product is one of the most important cleaning solvents that we have. Even tobacco does have spiritual effects. If you look at the use of sema in the Anishinaabe community, for example, it is considered a sacred herb. It is used as a coven to exchange knowledge. It's burnt by men. It's used in water by women. It's part of ceremonial practice. We understand these substances can have benefits. We're not here to say they're bad. They can be harmful. They can be risky. They may have minimal impact on a person's life. You could have someone who drinks who designates a driver, but they still drink enough to get hungover. They may avoid mixing with other drugs, but they still drink to the point that they don't feel well. Where you see problematic use is where a person continues using to the point they start to experience multiple harms. And finally, where we see addiction or dependency is a treatable or medical condition that involves compulsive use despite ongoing, repeated, and accruing negative effects. You're going to work with clients that move back and forth between these stages over time. They're going to move both ways. That's okay. You're there to support them. You can help them identify what harmful use looks like. So physical signs may include tolerance, needing to use more to get the same effects, feeling unwell when you can't use, experiencing new or worsening health conditions, even if you think the health condition has nothing to do with the substance you're consuming. It's important to mention to your healthcare provider what substances you're using. Just like it's important to tell the mechanic what's going on with your car when you bring it in. Overconsumption and overdose obviously can be a sign of problematic use. We have isolation, avoidance, and lying. If someone started using substances because they were using with their friends, and a year later they're avoiding their friends to use substances, that is a sign of dependency. They're prioritizing substance use over other obligations. If they're falling into debt, if they're accruing significant financial cost to use, if they're breaking rules while driving while impaired, breaking laws to use drugs, committing crime while impaired, if their performance is declining, if they have issues with learning, worsening stress, anxiety, depression, intrusive or unfamiliar thoughts, as well as hallucinations, delusions, or mood swings, all of which can be signs of problematic or harmful use. And if you are ever working with a client and they experience new or worsening issues of intrusive or unfamiliar thoughts, thoughts of apathy, questioning why things are important, considering why they matter, this is a time that is very important for them to understand these can be signs of onsets of significant mental health conditions, and they need to speak with a healthcare provider. This could be as simple as speaking to 988, which is a suicide crisis hotline in Canada. It could be something like booking in with a mental health counselor. If you're a parent or a relative, it could be connecting with something like our Parent Support Hub, which I'll mention in a moment. But finally, before we wrap up, how to reduce risk of harm. Limit or avoid substance use prior to age 25. Look for lower THC products. Avoid mixing with medications and other substances, particularly alcohol. I often say drinking alcohol is like having a really jealous best friend. Alcohol wants you to drink, it doesn't want you to do anything else. If you mix it with other substances, it will get you for it. Designate a sober driver and have a backup plan. If you're using tobacco, speak with a trusted healthcare provider about strategies that can help you quit. Avoid substance use when doing things that require focus and coordination. And finally, speak with your healthcare provider if you're feeling unwell to come up with a safe strategy to manage your health. Now, very last thing have for today is to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I do have a quick survey. Please take a moment to fill it out. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat. There's also a QR code that you can use. You can visit our website at talksubstance.org to learn more about our resources. You can visit our Parent Support Hub if you are someone who is working with a youth and you are concerned about their substance use. The Parent Support Hub is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It allows you access to speak through TELUS Mental Health to a mental health professional who can help you with brief intervention support. You can actually book up to 5 free counseling sessions with them at no cost, which is wonderful. You can also visit our website for various other resources, including our Substances at a Glance, as well as finding other recordings of other presentations or checking out many of our other bookings. I want to thank you all for joining today.